An orphaned puppy cried for help in the freezing snow. And what happened next will melt your heart. A gruff old man stops when no one else would, and that single moment unravels everything. He thought he was just saving a dog, but behind those eyes is a secret. And what follows is nothing like he expected. He didn't go looking for trouble, but now trouble's found him. What was that puppy really running from? And how far will one man go when he realizes he might be the only one who cares? Your presence here is powerful. In a world full of noise, it's the quiet gestures of compassion that truly stand out. If your heart still makes room for kindness, you're already one of us. The bitter winter wind howled across the empty Kansas road as Russell Bragg squinted through his frost-covered windshield. His old pickup truck rumbled beneath him, the heater struggling against the freezing temperatures. The clock on his dashboard read 8:45, and the darkness pressed in around the weak beam of his headlights. Russell's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as snow pelted the glass. His bad leg, a souvenir from Vietnam, ached with the cold. He hadn't wanted to go out tonight, but he'd needed supplies from town. At 62 years old, he'd learned to live with the solitude of his remote farmhouse, finding comfort in the quiet routine of his days. A flash of movement caught his eye. There, in the middle of his lane, sat something small and dark against the snowy road. Russell's heart jumped as he yanked the wheel hard to the right. The truck's tires lost their grip, and the vehicle fishtailed wildly before sliding to a stop on the shoulder. "Damn fool thing," he muttered, his heart pounding. Through the passenger window he could make out a tiny shape shivering in the snow. A puppy, no bigger than a loaf of bread, huddled against the bitter wind. Russell stared straight ahead, telling himself to drive on. He had no business with a dog. He'd spent the last decade keeping the world at arm's length, and he liked it that way. But as he reached for the gear shift, an old memory surfaced. His daughter Sarah at age 8, cradling their family dog when it was just a pup. "Aw, hell," he growled, grabbing his coat. The cold hit him like a punch as he stepped out of the truck. His bad leg protested as he trudged through the snow. The puppy cowered as Russell approached, but it was too cold and weak to run. Its brown fur was matted with ice, and it trembled violently. Without allowing himself to think too much about it, Russell scooped up the tiny creature. It felt like nothing in his large, calloused hands. "Just for tonight," he told himself firmly, wrapping the pup in his coat. "Till the storm passes." Back in the truck, he deposited his shivering bundle on the passenger seat. The puppy burrowed into the warm fabric, its small body still shaking. Russell cranked up the heater and pointed the vents toward his unexpected passenger. As he drove, he found himself glancing over more often than he'd like to admit. The pup's eyes were starting to droop as warmth seeped into its tiny frame. Something tugged at Russell's heart, a feeling he'd worked hard to bury over the years. 20 minutes later, he pulled up to his farmhouse, a weathered 2-story structure that had seen better days. Inside, Russell carried the puppy straight to the old wood stove in the living room. He set out a cardboard box nearby, lining it with an old blanket. "There," he said gruffly, placing the puppy in its makeshift bed. "That'll do for now." But as he straightened up, his eyes fell on the photograph hanging on the wall. Sarah on her 16th birthday, her smile bright and carefree. It was the last picture he had of her, taken just months before the argument that drove them apart. She'd died 5 years later, before they could make things right. The puppy whimpered softly, drawing Russell's attention back to the present. It had managed to crawl out of the box and was attempting to follow him, its small legs wobbling with each step. "Now don't get any ideas," Russell said, his gruff voice softening despite himself. "This isn't permanent." But even as he spoke the words, he found himself heading to the kitchen. He rummaged through his cupboards until he found an old bowl, which he filled with warm water. In the back of his fridge was some leftover hamburger from 2 nights ago. He warmed it slightly and crumbled it into small pieces. The puppy's tail wagged weakly as Russell set down the food and water. It looked up at him with trusting brown eyes that reminded him so much of Sarah's that his chest tightened. He watched as the small creature ate hungrily, its shivering finally beginning to subside. "You're trouble, you know that?" Russell muttered, lowering himself into his old armchair with a grunt. His leg throbbed, and he tried to focus on that discomfort rather than the memories threatening to surface. But as the puppy finished eating and stumbled over to curl up against his boot, Russell felt something crack in the walls he'd built around his heart. The wind continued to howl outside, rattling the windows of the old farmhouse. But inside, for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel quite so empty. Russell told himself it was just for one night, just until the storm passed. But deep down he knew something had already changed, something he wasn't quite ready to name. The morning sun filtered through Russell's dusty windows as he sipped his black coffee, watching the puppy explore the kitchen on wobbly legs. In the clear light of day, something about the dog's movements caught his attention. It would occasionally flinch or whimper when stretching, behavior that seemed odd for a young pup. Setting down his mug, Russell lowered himself to the floor with a grunt. "Come here, little fella," he called softly. The puppy approached, tail wagging tentatively. As Russell ran his weathered hands over the dog's body, his jaw tightened. Beneath the matted fur, he found a series of circular burns, cigarette burns, scattered across the pup's back. Around its neck, an angry red gash suggested something had been tied too tightly, cutting into the flesh. The wound was crusty and warm to the touch. "Jesus Christ," Russell muttered, anger rising in his chest. He'd seen enough cruelty in Vietnam to recognize intentional harm when he saw it. 20 minutes later, his old pickup truck rattled down a familiar dirt road. Doc Miller had been the town's veterinarian for 40 years before retiring, and more importantly, he knew how to keep quiet when needed. The small farmhouse came into view, smoke curling from its chimney. Doc Miller opened the door before Russell could knock. "Russell Bragg," he said, genuine surprise in his voice. "Hasn't been a dog in your life since Sarah's old retriever." Russell shifted uncomfortably. "Found this one in the storm last night. Need you to take a look." Inside, Doc Miller's gentle hands examined the puppy on his kitchen table. His face grew darker with each discovery. "Systematic abuse," he said finally, cleaning the neck wound with practiced care. "Someone kept this dog confined, probably with wire. The burns—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "There's been talk," Doc continued, applying antibiotic ointment. "Whispers about illegal breeding operations in the abandoned farms out past Route 12. Local authorities don't seem interested in investigating." Russell watched as the doctor worked, something cold and hard settling in his stomach. "Got a name for this pup yet?" Doc asked, breaking into his thoughts. Russell hadn't planned on naming the dog at all, but found himself saying, "Tank. Seems fitting. Little guy's tougher than he looks." Doc Miller smiled, handing Russell a bag of supplies. "Clean the neck wound twice daily. These antibiotics should clear up the infection." "And Russell?" He paused, meeting the older man's eyes. "Good to see you caring about something again." Back home, Russell spent the afternoon following Doc's instructions, surprised by how naturally it came back to him. The gentle way of handling an animal, the soft words of reassurance. Tank responded to the care with cautious trust, his tail wagging more confidently with each passing hour. Russell had just finished the evening treatment when a knock echoed through the house. Tank's ears perked up, and he let out a small bark. The first Russell had heard from him. The last person Russell expected to find on his porch was a small girl, no more than 10 years old, with wild black curls and determined brown eyes. She wore a coat that was too big and boots that had seen better days, but her stance was unwavering as she looked up at him. "That's my dog," she said without preamble, pointing past Russell to where Tank stood in the doorway. Russell blinked, caught off guard by her directness. "Your dog?" "His name is Tank," she continued firmly. "I named him that because even though he was the smallest in his litter, he acted big and brave." Her voice caught slightly, but she pressed on. "They took him from me 3 months ago. I've been looking ever since." Tank whined softly from behind Russell's legs, his tail giving a tentative wag, but he didn't rush forward as Russell might have expected if this was a joyful reunion. "Who's they?" Russell asked, studying the girl's face. "Mr. Keller's men," she replied, her small hands curling into fists. "They came when they evicted us. Took Tank just to be mean." Her chin lifted. "My name's Cassia Dooley, and I can prove he's mine." Russell looked between the brave little girl on his porch and the trembling puppy behind him. The cigarette burns on Tank's back suddenly felt even more sinister. "Maybe you better come in and tell me about it," he said finally, stepping aside to let her pass. Tank watched Cassia enter, his tail still wagging uncertainly. The pup's reaction, recognition mixed with hesitation, told Russell that the girl was telling the truth. But something had changed in the months they'd been apart. Whatever Tank had endured had left scars deeper than the physical ones. Cassia stood in Russell's living room, small but unshakable, ready to fight for what was hers. And Russell, who had spent years keeping the world at bay, found himself drawn into a story he knew would complicate his carefully maintained solitude. Russell crossed his arms, studying the small girl standing in his living room. "Look, I found this dog abandoned in a snowstorm. How do I know you're telling the truth?" "Because I can prove it," Cassia insisted, pulling a crumpled photo from her coat pocket. She smoothed it carefully on the coffee table. "See? That's Tank when he was littler. I took it with my mom's old phone." The photo showed a younger Tank, his fur healthier then, playing with a worn tennis ball. The markings matched, the white patch on his chest, the brown spots around his eyes. "Could be any similar-looking dog," Russell said gruffly, but doubt crept into his voice. Cassia's eyes flashed. "Tank, come!" she called softly, using a distinctive two-note whistle. The puppy's ears perked up immediately. He limped over to her, his tail wagging with growing recognition. When she knelt down, he pressed his nose to her hand, then gave it a tentative lick. "Mr. Keller manages the Garden View apartments," Cassia explained, gently stroking Tank's head. 3 months ago, he said we had to leave. Mom showed him our rent receipts, but he said they were fake. He brought these big men who threw our stuff out in the rain." Her voice trembled slightly. "When I tried to grab Tank, one of them just took him, laughed, and said maybe now we'd learn our lesson." Russell shifted uncomfortably. The cigarette burns on Tank's back seemed to burn in his mind. "Where are you staying now?" "Behind Jerry's gas station," Cassia admitted. "In a trailer. Mom's trying to save enough for an apartment deposit, but—" She straightened her shoulders. "I'm not leaving without Tank. He needs me." "It's getting dark," Russell said firmly. "You need to go home." "But—" "Go home. Tank stays here for now." Cassia's chin quivered, but she stood tall. "I'll be back tomorrow," she declared, then turned and marched out into the cold. Russell watched through the window as she walked away, her 2 big boots leaving uneven tracks in the snow. Tank whined softly beside him. The next morning, Russell drove his rusty pickup to Jerry's gas station, telling himself he was just getting coffee. Behind the building, he spotted a battered trailer with plastic covering one window. As he watched, Cassia emerged, wearing the same oversized coat. Fresh bruises marked her forearm. She saw him and walked over, her face set. "I told you I'd be back." "Those bruises," Russell said quietly. "Keller's men?" Cassia nodded. "They came last night. Said we had 24 hours to clear out of the trailer, too." Her voice caught. "Mom's scared. She doesn't know I'm here." Through the trailer's uncovered window, Russell glimpsed a thin woman with Cassia's dark curls, frantically packing their few belongings into garbage bags. Her hands shook as she worked. "Tank was all I had," Cassia continued. "He made me feel brave, safe." She looked up at Russell, her brown eyes too old for her young face. "Please, help us." Russell stared at the trailer, at the frightened mother inside, at the brave little girl before him. He thought of Tank's scars, of Cassia's bruises, of all the cruelty that went unchallenged in the world. "Tell your mother," he said finally. that I have a spare room above my garage. It's not much, but it's warm, and it's got a good lock on the door." Cassia's eyes widened. "Really?" "Really." Russell cleared his throat. "And Tank? Well, he needs someone who knows his whistle." For the first time, a real smile broke across Cassia's face. It transformed her completely, reminding Russell that beneath her fierce determination, she was still just a child who had been forced to grow up too fast. As he watched Cassia run back to tell her mother, Russell felt something shift inside him, a wall he had built decades ago beginning to crack. Tank's abuse, Cassia's bruises, her mother's fear, it all connected in a web of cruelty that someone needed to stand against. He thought of his own daughter, gone now, and all the times he had failed to be there for her. Maybe it wasn't too late to do better this time. Maybe Tank had led him to this moment for a reason. Russell straightened up, feeling the familiar ache in his bad leg. He had a spare room to prepare, and a few calls to make. Dean Keller and his men might run this town through fear, but they had never faced someone with nothing left to lose, someone who had finally found something worth fighting for. Russell sat at his kitchen table early the next morning, staring at the classified ads section of the local newspaper. Circles and notes marked properties managed by Dean Keller, more than he had expected. Tank lay at his feet, his breathing steady and peaceful. "Half the rental properties in town," Russell muttered, running a weathered hand through his silver beard. "No wonder folks are scared to speak up." He had spent the past week quietly asking around town, careful not to draw attention. The pattern was always the same: sudden evictions, missing paperwork, threats if anyone complained. The coffee shop waitress whispered about her cousin who had been forced out last winter. The grocery store clerk mentioned an elderly couple who disappeared overnight, leaving everything behind. Tank's ears perked up at a familiar sound outside, the distinct two-note whistle that meant Cassia was approaching. The puppy's tail began to wag, though he still looked to Russell for permission before moving. "Go on, then," Russell said gruffly, but with a hint of warmth in his voice. The door creaked open and Cassia stepped inside, her two large boots leaving small puddles on the floor. "Morning, Mr. Bragg," she said, kneeling to greet Tank. The puppy pressed against her, his whole body wiggling with joy. Russell watched them, noting how Tank's scars were healing, fur beginning to grow back over the burn marks. The wire gash around his neck had almost disappeared. "He's getting stronger," he observed. "Mom says I'm not supposed to come here anymore," Cassia said suddenly, her small fingers buried in Tank's fur. "She's scared of making Mr. Keller angry? But I told her you're different. You're not scared of him, are you?" The question hung in the air. Russell thought about his daughter Sarah, how she had once asked him similar questions about bullies at school. He had told her to keep her head down, stay out of trouble. 2 years later, she stopped talking to him altogether. "Your mother's right to be careful," he said slowly. "Keller's got a lot of power in this town." He paused, studying Cassia's determined face. But being scared and being smart are two different things. Russell pulled out a chair, gesturing for Cassia to sit. She did, Tank settling at her feet. "Tell me about the day they took Tank," he said. "Everything you remember." "It was raining," Cassia began, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "They came early before Mom left for work. 4 men in black jackets. One had a clipboard, but he wasn't writing anything down." Her fingers tightened in Tank's fur. "They said we had 10 minutes to get out. When Mom showed them our receipts, the clipboard man just laughed and ripped them up." Russell made notes in his small notebook, his handwriting cramped but precise. "Did you recognize any of them?" Cassia nodded. "The tall one with the scar. He works at the hardware store sometimes. And the clipboard man, he's always with Mr. Keller. Has a fancy watch that makes a clicking sound." Smart girl, Russell thought, observant. "What happened next?" "They started throwing our stuff out, books, clothes, Mom's sewing machine. They didn't care what broke. Tank tried to protect me, but he was just a puppy." Her voice cracked slightly. The tall man grabbed him by the neck. I screamed, but they just laughed and drove away with him in their truck. Russell's pen pressed hard against the paper. The familiar weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders, a weight he had spent years trying to shake off. But looking at Cassia's brave face, at Tank's trusting eyes, he knew he couldn't walk away this time. "Your mother found the trailer that same day?" "Mr. Jerry from the gas station helped us. He's nice, but he's scared too. Everyone's scared of Mr. Keller." Russell stood up, his bad leg stiff from sitting. He limped to the window, watching as dark clouds gathered on the horizon. Another storm coming. "Tank's getting better," he said finally. "Strong enough to start learning some commands. Maybe you could help with that." Cassia's face lit up. "Really? Mom says I can't have a dog in the trailer, but—" "We'll work something out," Russell interrupted. "For now, just come by after school. Tank needs the company and—" He hesitated, then added gruffly, "Well, someone needs to keep an eye on you too." For the next hour, Russell watched as Cassia worked with Tank, teaching him to sit, stay, come. The puppy responded eagerly to her gentle voice, while still checking with Russell for approval. Something about their three-way bond stirred memories Russell had long buried, of teaching Sarah to ride a bike, of family dinners, of moments lost to time and stubbornness. Later, after Cassia had gone home, Russell made a call to an old friend at the county records office. Then another to a lawyer he knew from his mechanic days. Small steps, careful ones, but steps nonetheless. Tank padded over, resting his head on Russell's knee. "Getting ourselves into trouble, aren't we?" Russell muttered, scratching behind the dog's ears. But his voice lacked its usual gruffness. In its place was something that sounded almost like purpose. Russell's old pickup truck rattled down Main Street as evening shadows crept across the small Kansas town. He pulled into the parking lot of Joe's Diner, where a familiar figure waited, Arlen Divick, still wearing his heavy boots and denim jacket, despite no longer being sheriff. "Looking rough around the edges, Russ," Arlen said as Russell slid into the booth across from him. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on both their weathered faces. "Feels rougher than it looks," Russell replied, his coffee arriving before he could finish speaking. The waitress knew them both from years back, knew enough to leave them alone with their steaming mugs. Arlen leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Been asking around about those things you mentioned. Keller's got his fingers in more pies than just real estate." He pulled out a worn notebook. "Those evictions, all illegal. But the victims are too scared to fight back. And there's more." Russell's hands tightened around his coffee mug. "The animals? Got a cousin works animal control 2 counties over. Says they've been finding dogs, fighting dogs mostly, abandoned all through the area, all with similar injuries." Arlen's eyes were hard. "Like those burns on your pup." The coffee turned bitter in Russell's mouth as he thought of Tank's scars. "Any proof?" "Nothing solid. That's how Keller operates, but—" Arlen slid a piece of paper across the table. "His guys make regular trips to this warehouse on the edge of town. Midnight runs, usually Thursdays." Russell studied the address, memorizing it. "Tonight's Thursday. Figured you'd notice that." Arlen sat back, studying his old friend. "You're not the same man who holed up in that cabin 10 years ago, Russell. Something's changed." Russell thought of Cassia's determined face, of Tank's trusting eyes. "Maybe I got tired of looking the other way." As darkness settled over the town, Russell parked his truck 2 blocks from the warehouse. Tank sat quietly in the passenger seat, ears alert. "Stay," Russell commanded softly, grabbing his old camera from under the seat. The warehouse loomed ahead, its metal walls reflecting the weak moonlight. Russell crouched behind a dumpster as a white van pulled up to the loading dock. 2 men emerged, carrying cages covered with tarps. The metallic sounds of frightened animals echoed in the night air. Russell's camera clicked steadily as he documented the scene. The man with the clipboard, just as Cassia had described, complete with the flashy watch, directed the operation with sharp gestures. After 20 minutes, the van departed. Russell waited another 5 before starting back toward his truck. The alley was narrow, dark, and in retrospect, he should have known better. The first blow caught him from behind, sending him sprawling. His camera clattered across the pavement as a heavy boot connected with his ribs. Russell rolled, managing to block the next kick and struggle to his feet. His attacker was big, one of Keller's muscle men, face hidden in the shadows. "Should have stayed in your cabin, old man," the thug growled, landing a solid punch to Russell's jaw. Russell fought back, his old military training surfacing, but his bad leg betrayed him, buckling at a crucial moment. Another punch sent him down hard. Oh, through blurring vision, he saw the man reach for something in his jacket. A snarl ripped through the darkness. Tank burst from the shadows, a fury of teeth and protective rage. The dog latched onto the attacker's arm, refusing to let go, even as the man howled and swung wildly. Russell used the distraction to drag himself up, landing a solid right hook that dropped his assailant. Tank maintained his grip until Russell whistled sharply. The dog immediately released and returned to Russell's side, hackles still raised, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Good boy," Russell gasped, one hand pressed to his ribs as he retrieved his camera. "Let's go home." The drive back was painful. Tank pressed close against Russell's leg, offering warmth and comfort. When Russell finally pulled up to his cabin, he saw Arlen's truck already waiting. "Jesus, Russell," Arlen muttered, helping him inside. "Told you to be careful." "Got the pictures, though," Russell managed, easing into his chair as Tank kept anxious watch nearby. "And something else. Got a good look at his watch. Custom job, gold with diamonds. But there aren't many like that in town." Arlen cleaned Russell's cuts with careful efficiency. "Might help identify him. But this isn't a game, Russell. Keller's showing his teeth now." Russell reached out to scratch Tank's ears, remembering the absolute loyalty in the dog's attack. "Yeah, well, he's not the only one with teeth." Tank pressed his head against Russell's hand, his eyes never leaving his human's face. In that moment, the bond between them was tangible, forged in trust and cemented in battle. Russell thought of all the nights he'd spent alone in this cabin, convinced he was better off that way. Now, with his ribs aching and his dog standing guard, he realized how wrong he'd been. The steady beep of hospital monitors pulled Russell back to consciousness. Harsh fluorescent lights made him squint as the white ceiling came into focus. His ribs screamed with every breath, and his face felt like it had gone 10 rounds with a brick wall. "You're awake!" Cassia's voice came from his left. She perched on a plastic chair, her small hands clutching the armrests. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she'd been there a while. "Tank?" Russell's voice came out as a rasp. "He's at the vet clinic," Arlen answered from the doorway. "Got some nasty cuts, but Doc says he'll be fine. Brave dog you got there." Russell tried to sit up, but thought better of it when pain lanced through his side. "How long?" "About 18 hours, Arlen said, moving closer. 3 cracked ribs, concussion, and enough bruises to paint a masterpiece. Could have been worse if Tank hadn't stepped in." Cassia's face crumpled. "This is my fault. I shouldn't have gotten you involved." "Hey now." Russell reached out, wincing, to pat her hand. "Nobody makes me do anything I don't want to do." "But Keller's men, they're getting worse," Cassia insisted. "Mom says we should just leave town, but—" Her voice broke. "Nobody else is standing up to him. Everyone's too scared." Russell exchanged looks with Arlen. The former sheriff's expression was grim. "She's right. Keller's got half the town council in his pocket. Regular folks are too afraid of losing their homes to speak up." A nurse bustled in to check Russell's vitals, tutting at his attempt to sit up straighter. After she left, Cassia leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "There's someone who might help. His name's Rudy Martinez. Keller kicked him and his family out last winter, just like us. He tried to fight it in court, but lost everything." "Martinez?" Arlen straightened. "Used to work maintenance at the community center?" Cassia nodded eagerly. "He kept records, pictures of the bad wiring, the black mold Keller wouldn't fix. Mom says he even recorded some conversations." Russell's mind started working despite the pain medication. "Arlen, with my photos from the warehouse and Martinez's evidence. Might be enough to get the State Housing Authority involved, Arlen finished. But we'd need more. Proof of the animal trafficking, documentation of illegal evictions. I can help. Cassia's eyes lit up. I know all the families Keller hurt. They trust me. Russell studied her determined face. So young, yet so fierce. He thought of his own daughter, how he'd withdrawn from her life after her mother died, how he'd failed her. The guilt that had driven him into isolation for so many years stirred in his chest. This won't be safe, he warned Cassia. Keller's already shown what he's willing to do. I'm not afraid, she declared, chin lifted. Tank wasn't afraid to protect you. I won't be afraid either. Russell felt something shift inside him, like a rusty gear finally turning. For years he'd hidden from the world, convincing himself it was better that way. But looking at this brave little girl, at his friend Arlen standing ready to help, he knew he couldn't walk away. All right, he said slowly. But we do this smart. No more midnight surveillance without backup. He looked at Arlen. Can you find Martinez? Arlen nodded. Got some contacts who might know where he landed. What about Tank? He stays with me, Russell said firmly. He's earned that right. He turned to Cassia. And you, no heroics. You work with your mom to connect us with other families, but safely, through Arlen. Deal. Cassia's smile could have lit up the whole hospital. They spent the next hour planning, speaking in low voices. Arlen would reach out to Martinez and his old law enforcement contacts. Cassia would carefully compile a list of affected families. Russell would focus on recovering and organizing the evidence they already had. We'll need somewhere secure to meet, Arlen said. Keller's got eyes all over town. My cabin, Russell suggested. Remote enough to spot visitors, defensible if needed. Cassia bounced in her chair. And Tank can keep watch. As if summoned by his name, a scratch at the door preceded a familiar face. The veterinary technician led Tank in, his leg bandaged, but his tail wagging. The dog made a beeline for Russell's bed, whining softly. Easy, boy, Russell murmured as Tank gently rested his head on the mattress. We're both a little banged up. Looking at his unlikely family, a retired sheriff, a determined little girl, and a loyal dog who'd risked everything to protect him, Russell felt the last of his isolation crumble away. For the first time in years, he had something worth fighting for. Keller won't know what hit him, Cassia declared, scratching Tank's ears. Russell smiled despite his bruises. No, he agreed quietly. He won't. Russell's old pickup rumbled down the quiet streets as dawn broke over the small Kansas town. His hands gripped the steering wheel tight, knuckles white. Next to him, Tank whined softly, picking up on his tension. Got the files ready to go, Russell spoke into his cell phone. Meeting the reporter at 9. Good, Arlen replied through the speaker. Martinez's testimony is solid. Those maintenance records he kept are going to bury Keller. The past week had been a whirlwind. Once they'd found Rudy Martinez, the former maintenance worker had opened a floodgate of evidence. Photos of dangerous code violations in Keller's properties. Secret recordings of threats made to tenants. Financial records showing systematic fraud. But most damning were the connections to the animal trafficking ring. Martinez had stumbled across shipping manifests while fixing a leak in Keller's office. Documents linking 3 local warehouses to illegal breeding operations across state lines. Cassia's mom gathered statements from 12 other families, Russell continued. All illegal evictions, all threatened into silence. That girl's got more guts than half the town council, Arlen said with approval. Russell smiled despite his exhaustion. Cassia had thrown herself into helping build their case, carefully approaching other victims of Keller's schemes. Her mother had overcome her initial fear to join the fight, documenting their own illegal eviction in detail. Speaking of which, I'm heading to pick them up now, Russell said. Thought they might want to be there when we hand everything over to the press. Good idea. I'll meet you. Arlen's voice cut off abruptly. Arlen? Static crackled through the phone. Then Arlen's voice returned, urgent. "Russell, just got a call from my contact at the station. There's been a break-in reported at the trailer park." Russell's blood ran cold. "Where?" "Lot 16. Behind the gas and go." Cassia's trailer. Russell yanked the wheel hard, tires squealing as he made a sharp U-turn. Tank braced himself against the seat, hackles rising. "I'm 5 minutes out," Russell barked into the phone. "Call it in." "Already did. But Russell, be careful. This has Keller written all over it." The pickup's engine roared as Russell pressed the accelerator to the floor. His mind raced with possibilities, each worse than the last. He should have seen this coming. Should have known Keller would strike first. The trailer park came into view, eerily quiet in the pale morning light. Russell's headlights swept across empty lots until he reached number 16. His heart stopped. The trailer door hung open, swinging slightly in the breeze. Papers and belongings littered the ground outside. Tank leaped from the truck before it fully stopped, nose to the ground and growling low. "Cassia!" Russell shouted, stumbling out of the pickup. "Sarah!" No answer. He limped toward the trailer as fast as his bad leg would allow, gun drawn. The interior was chaos. Drawers dumped, furniture overturned, signs of a struggle. A child's backpack lay spilled near the door. No, Russell muttered, searching room to room. Empty. But there was blood, small drops on the linoleum floor that made his stomach lurch. His phone buzzed. "Arlen." "They're gone," Russell said before his friend could speak. Place is torn apart. There's blood." "Jesus." Arlen's voice was grim. "Police are 3 minutes out. Any sign where they took them?" "Tank's trying to get a scent, but—" Russell broke off as he spotted something on the kitchen counter. A plain white envelope with his name written on it. With trembling fingers, he tore it open. Inside was a single typed note: "Back off, or they die. You have 24 hours. Rage and fear warred in Russell's chest as police sirens wailed in the distance. He'd let this happen. Let Keller get to them first. Just like he'd failed his own daughter years ago, he'd failed to protect Cassie and her mother when they needed him most. Tank returned to his side, whining anxiously. The dog pressed against Russell's leg, offering silent support. "Arlen?" Russell's voice was deadly calm now. "I need everything you've got on Keller's properties, every address, every warehouse, and I need it now." "Russell, wait for the police. We can—" "He's got them, Arlen. That little girl trusted me to keep her safe, and he's got them." Russell's grip tightened on the phone. 24 hours. After that. He couldn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. A heavy sigh came through the line. "I'll send you the addresses. But Russell, you're not doing this alone. Give me 30 minutes to make some calls." Russell stared at the blood drops on the floor, at the scattered drawings from Cassia's backpack. She'd fought back. He could see it in the chaos of the scene. That brave, fierce little girl had fought back. 30 minutes, he agreed. "Then Tank and I start hunting." Police cars pulled up outside, lights flashing. Russell tucked the note into his pocket and took a deep breath. 24 hours to find them. 24 hours before Keller made good on his threat. He looked down at Tank, seeing the same determination in the dog's eyes that he felt in his heart. "We're going to find them, boy. Whatever it takes." Russell's pickup crawled down the dirt road, headlights off in the pre-dawn darkness. Tank sat alert in the passenger seat, nose twitching. In the rearview mirror, Arlen's patrol car followed at a distance, running dark as well. Rudy's tip had led them here, an abandoned dairy farm 10 miles outside town. The old informant had broken down crying when he heard about Cassia, finally revealing what he knew about Keller's operation. "He uses the old Whitman barn," Rudy had whispered. "That's where they process the dogs before shipping them out." Now, as they approached the property, Tank suddenly stiffened. The dog's ears perked forward and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Russell killed the engine, letting the truck coast to a stop behind a stand of trees. His hand found Tank's head, steadying them both. "You smell them, don't you, boy?" he murmured. "You smell Cassia." Tank's tail thumped once against the seat. In the darkness, Russell could just make out the hulking shape of the barn ahead, silhouetted against the lightening eastern sky. A single window glowed yellow near the roof, the only sign of life. Arlen's car pulled up beside them. The former sheriff stepped out, checking his weapon. "Called it in," he whispered through Russell's window. "State police are 20 minutes out. We should wait." Russell shook his head, already reaching for his shotgun. "Keller's desperate. 20 minutes might be too late." He opened his door slowly, wincing as his bad leg protested. "You stay here. Coordinate with the police when they arrive. Tank and I will go in." "Russell, this is suicide. He'll have armed men in there." "Probably." Russell pumped a shell into the chamber. "But that little girl trusted me. I'm not letting her down again." Before Arlen could argue further, Tank's head snapped toward the barn. A muffled scream cut through the pre-dawn silence, high-pitched, terrified, a child's scream. Russell was moving before he consciously decided to, Tank at his heels. They crossed the open ground in long strides, staying low. The screaming had stopped, but Russell's heart thundered in his ears. He pressed his back against the weathered barn wall, inching toward a side door. Inside, voices echoed off the high ceiling. Keller's cultured tones carried clearly. "Now, Sarah, be reasonable. All I need is your signature on these papers. Then this whole unfortunate business can be forgotten." "Never." Sarah Dooley's voice was hoarse but determined. "You're finished, Keller. People know what you've done." "Mama!" Cassia's frightened cry was followed by the sound of a slap. Russell's vision went red. He kicked the door open, shotgun leading the way. The barn's interior was lit by portable work lights, creating harsh shadows among the empty stalls. The smell of gasoline hung heavy in the air. Keller stood on a raised platform near the center, one hand gripping Cassia's arm while the other held a pistol to Sarah's head. Two thugs flanked them, both armed. Everyone froze at Russell's entrance. "Let them go, Keller." Russell's voice was deadly calm as he sighted down the barrel. "It's over." Keller's polished facade cracked, revealing the desperation beneath. "Drop the gun, old man, or I'll kill them both." "You do that. You won't leave this barn alive." Russell took a step forward. "Your choice." For a moment, the tableau held. Russell's shotgun against Keller's pistol, while Sarah and Cassia trembled between them. Then Tank, who had slipped in unnoticed, launched himself at one of Keller's men. The thug went down screaming as Tank's teeth found his gun arm. Chaos erupted. The second man opened fire, forcing Russell to dive behind a support beam. Keller dragged his hostages toward a back office, shouting orders. The sharp smell of gasoline grew stronger as something sparked and caught. Flames raced up the dry wooden walls with frightening speed. Smoke began filling the upper reaches of the barn. Through the haze, Russell spotted Tank circling toward the office where Keller had retreated. The dog's path gave Russell an idea. Moving fast despite his leg, Russell worked his way around the perimeter. Gunfire followed him, but the smoke worked in his favor now. He could hear Cassia coughing, hear Sarah pleading. The office door was partially open. Russell burst through it just as Tank crashed through a rotted section of wall behind Keller. The property manager spun, trying to track both threats. His pistol wavered between them. "It's finished," Russell growled. "Drop it." Instead, Keller grabbed Cassia, using her as a shield. "Back off." "I'll kill her. I swear I'll—" Tank struck like lightning, jaws clamping onto Keller's gun arm. The weapon discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as Keller howled in pain. Russell crossed the space in 2 strides, the stock of his shotgun connecting with Keller's jaw in a satisfying crack. The man crumpled. Tank immediately released him and darted to Cassia, who threw her arms around the dog's neck. Sarah rushed to embrace them both. "We need to move," Russell shouted over the roar of the flames. The office was filling with smoke. "Now!" Tank led the way, guiding them through the inferno that the barn had become. They stumbled out into the pre-dawn air just as emergency vehicles began arriving, sirens wailing. Arlen ran to meet them, supporting Russell as his leg finally gave out. They watched from a safe distance as firefighters fought to contain the blaze. Cassia wouldn't let go of Tank, who stood guard over her and Sarah with fierce protectiveness. State police led a handcuffed Keller and his men to waiting patrol cars. The morning sun crept over the horizon as firefighters battled the last of the flames consuming the old barn. Russell sat on the back of an ambulance, letting a paramedic check his injuries while keeping his eyes fixed on Cassia and her mother. The little girl hadn't let go of Tank since their escape, her fingers buried deep in the dog's fur as she watched the emergency crews work. Arlen approached, his badge glinting in the early light. "State police just finished booking Keller and his men," he said, settling beside Russell. "Found quite a collection of incriminating documents in his car. Seems our friend got sloppy when he panicked." Russell nodded, wincing as the paramedic wrapped his ribs. "What about the evidence we gathered?" "Between Rudy's testimony, your photos, and the paperwork we collected." Arlen allowed himself a rare smile. "District attorney's already talking multiple felony charges. Illegal evictions, animal trafficking, assault, kidnapping. Keller's looking at 20 years minimum." Across the lot, news vans were arriving, reporters setting up cameras to capture the scene. A local TV journalist tried approaching Cassia and her mother, but Tank's low growl kept them at a respectful distance. Sarah Dooley held her daughter close, their faces tired but relieved. "Mrs. Dooley?" A woman in a crisp suit stepped forward, offering her card. "I'm Amanda Chen from the State Housing Authority. We'd like to offer you and your daughter immediate emergency accommodation, followed by permanent housing assistance. We're also preparing documentation for legal restitution from Mr. Keller's seized assets." Sarah's hands shook as she took the card. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." More officials arrived throughout the morning. The fire department declared the barn a total loss, though they'd managed to prevent the flames from spreading to nearby structures. Police evidence technicians sifted through the wreckage, recovering what they could from Keller's makeshift office. Russell tried to slip away quietly, but reporters had already caught wind of his role in the drama. They called out questions about his heroism, about standing up to corruption. He waved them off, limping toward his truck with Tank following close behind. "Russell, wait!" Cassia ran after him, her mother close behind. The girl threw her arms around his waist, careful of his injuries. "You're not leaving, are you?" He patted her shoulder awkwardly. "Just heading home, kid. Had enough excitement for one day." "The housing lady says we can move into a real apartment next week," Cassia said. "Will you and Tank come visit?" Russell glanced at Sarah, who smiled and nodded. "Course we will," he said gruffly. "Someone's got to make sure Tank remembers his manners." The local newspaper ran the story on its front page the next day. "Small-town heroes expose criminal enterprise." The article detailed Keller's years of exploitation, the brave whistleblowers who stood up to him, and the unlikely partnership between a former sheriff and a reclusive veteran that brought him down. Russell's name was mentioned, though the reporter noted he'd declined to be interviewed. Arlen brought him a copy, along with a fresh cup of coffee. They sat on Russell's porch watching Tank chase squirrels in the yard. "Not bad for a couple of old-timers," Arlen said. Russell grunted in agreement, but there was a hint of pride in his eyes as he watched Tank play in the morning sun. Sometimes, he realized, the best rewards came quietly, in a child's grateful smile, a dog's loyal heart, and the simple knowledge of having done what was right. The autumn breeze rustled through the newly planted maple tree in Russell's backyard. Tank bounded after a flock of sparrows, his healthy coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. His scars had faded to barely visible marks beneath his thick fur, much like the emotional wounds that had begun to heal in all of their hearts. Russell stood at the kitchen window, washing dishes and watching Tank play. The sound of pencils scratching against paper drifted from the dining room table where Cassia sat working on her homework. The house that had once echoed with emptiness now hummed with the quiet rhythm of family life. "Hey, Russell," Kesha called out. "Can you help me with this math problem?" He dried his hands on a dish towel, grateful for the excuse to take a break. As he pulled out a chair beside her, his eyes caught the stack of papers on the counter. Adoption documents, finally ready for filing. Sarah had approached him 3 weeks ago, tears in her eyes, asking if he would consider being Cassia's legal guardian. With her new job requiring frequent travel, and Cassia already spending most afternoons at his house, it made sense. But it was more than practicality. It was making official what they all already knew in their hearts. "Look what I made in art class," Cassia said, pulling a folded paper from her backpack. She smoothed it carefully on the table, a crayon drawing of 3 figures standing under a leafy tree. Russell recognized himself immediately, his silver beard rendered in careful gray strokes. Beside him stood a smaller figure with wild black curls, and at their feet, a happy dog with a long tail. "That's mighty fine work," Russell said, his voice gruff with emotion. He watched as Cassia bounced up and stuck the drawing on the refrigerator with a magnet, right next to her latest spelling test marked with a bright red A. Tank scratched at the back door, and Russell let him in. The dog immediately went to Cassia, resting his head on her lap while she scratched behind his ears. The transformation in Tank was remarkable. From the trembling, injured creature Russell had found in the snow to this confident, loving companion. "When do we go to court?" Cassia asked, looking up at Russell with those determined brown eyes that had first challenged him on his front porch months ago. "Next Tuesday," Russell answered, settling back into his chair. "Judge Thompson will make it all official." He paused, studying her face. "You sure you're okay with this? It's a big change." Cassia rolled her eyes in that way only 10-year-olds could perfect. "I've been okay with it since forever. You're already my dad in all the ways that matter." The words hit Russell square in the chest, warming places he thought had frozen solid years ago. He remembered his own daughter, gone too soon, and how he'd withdrawn from the world after losing her. Now here was this fierce, bright child, offering him a second chance at fatherhood. Outside, the maple tree's leaves danced in the wind, a tree they'd planted together last weekend to mark their new beginning. Russell had never been one for symbols or ceremonies, but watching Cassia pat down the soil around those young roots, he'd understood something profound about growth and healing. A timer dinged in the kitchen. "Cookies are done," Cassia announced, jumping up from her chair. Tank's tail thumped hopefully against the floor as she pulled on oven mitts that were still too big for her hands. Russell watched them, his family, and felt a peace he hadn't known in decades settle over him. He hadn't just saved a dog that snowy night. He'd saved himself, saved Cassia, saved the part of his heart he thought was lost forever. In trying to protect them, he'd found his own protection from loneliness and regret. The house filled with the warm smell of chocolate chip cookies and the sound of Cassia's laughter as Tank performed his best sitting pretty pose, hoping for a treat. These were the moments Russell had forgotten could exist, simple, perfect, alive with possibility. Thanks for watching. If any part of this story lingered with you, consider subscribing. I'll be here again tomorrow, sharing another tale that speaks to the soul.